I went through it for heavy equipment operation and repair. Yeah, it was enrolled. I went to the heart of the the last big downturn in 2009, June 2009. I was enrolled. I initially went there for truck driving, but then I I decided to go into heavy equipment operation and then also get a second training in heavy equipment repair. What they did there was built the foundations. They didn't teach you how to run everything perfectly, but they gave you the foundations that when you got out into the world, you'd be a couple steps up at other people, and you'd have the experience enough to get jobs.
Cool.
While I was there, the biggest thing that I learned was how to work. Like before that, I bounced around. I had lots of crummy jobs. I think before that, my longest employment was maybe 6 months. I just hopped around, did whatever I wanted. I was not the best employee there. You didn't really have much options. You could either get kicked out or be a decent employee. I had
Do you get kicked out for missing a certain amount of days, or how do you
you
typically
can
get?
uh,
Gotcha.
behavioral issues if you don't return from leave, any involvement in drugs, alcohol, anything like that on the center, or any one of their numerous rules. And I think that's one of the great lessons in life is that there's a lot of rules out there that, especially when you're young, it's not fun to follow them. But if you can get in that habit of just following, doing what you're supposed to, it's much easier to continue that on for the rest of your life and to succeed a lot more than if you hadn't. I would say that was very much the bigger impact on my life was the soft skills, was just learning how to cooperate with a boss, how to take instructions, and to move on. Be somewhat self-sufficient, being able to get up on time, be ready. It's very hard to be late to a day in class or a day in trade since you're there on center. And again, I feel that carried on into my future life and that I was not late after that versus before going to job corps, I was late all the time to work. It just got me into that rhythm of being on time, being early, and being prepared every day.
Great.
It gave you short-term goals, and then just carried that throughout my career.
And what was the typical day like in Job Corps? Like, how long were the days, and what were you doing on a day-to-day basis?
So trade-wise, I believe it started at 8 a.m. and was out at 4:30 or 5 p.m. Every day was our trade schedule, and you'd get there. Before that, it was free time, but they'd usually serve lunch or breakfast, 6 a.m. From then to 8, you had to show up at trade, and then in trade you were there based on what you were doing. Some days there would be classroom work. It'd be for heavy equipment operation. We were going over the math and of grade setting and stuff like that. But the majority of the time was spent actually learning the trade and doing work. Sometimes it was local on the center. We'd be doing improvements, but the majority of the time we were out in the community working on projects. One of the ones we worked on was building a sports field for a high school. Another was renovating a sports field and track, tearing it all up and putting new material down. Another was demolishing a KOA work site or KOA campground in expectation of bringing in a new subdivision and stuff like that. And also a lot of it was encouraged to learn one, train one. That mentality of you learn something, you teach someone something. So the instructor was there to make sure everything was done safely and to give the basics and make sure you're doing everything right. But then as a student, you were still responsible for helping other students. And that really solidified what you learned. You learn something, then you teach something, and then it's ingrained in you. The big thing was the safety. And that was a big thing I'd not paid so much attention to. We did have, while I was there, a student was on work leave, which was as a student, you would stay on site, but then you'd go work at a local company, and
Mhm.
he was killed because of
Oh my
failing.
gosh.
The company he was working for did not follow safety instructions. They did not
Oh
follow
my
basic
goodness.
safeties. And so that was a
That's
good hit home to everyone. And then since then, when I was working in heavy equipment, I was recognized as a very safety focused individual. And that was the greatest thing to me, was learning how to do everything safely and smoothly, I guess I should say. In heavy equipment, in a lot of things, there's the saying, smooth is fast, but first you learn how to do something smoothly in heavy equipment. That's just moving equipment without jarring motions, and then you
Mhm.
speed up. And then you learn how to take care of your employer's equipment and stuff like that there. Just the idea that you take care of everything that you're responsible for. And then there were the ability to have the contacts in the union that represents heavy equipment operators was huge. I know I reached out several times after I'd left for contacts. Hey, when I moved down to another state that had a large union representation, my instructor got me, who I hadn't talked to in about 8 years, reached out and he got me a contact for down there. After I graduated, I reached out to my instructor and he gave me contacts and gave a warm handoff to the union
Cool.
down there. That helped.
What state were you doing Job Corps in, and then what state did you move to?
I was in Job Corps in Washington at Fort Simcoe, which is middle of nowhere. And then I moved back to Oregon where I lived. I was there for 5 years, worked various construction, various heavy equipment jobs. And then I moved to New Mexico in 2015. And that's where I
Cool.
use that connection.
And what was the process of finding that first job? Were you talking to employers throughout Job Corps, or at the end start pulling together a resume? What is the process of going from graduating to first job look like?
It was a little different. At that time, the job market was dead. It was nearly
Mm,
impossible to get a job at that time. A couple of guys I knew who lived in the Seattle area started networking with the union because it's very strong up there, and they went right to work as soon as they left, and that worked well for them. Me, I went to Central Oregon, which is not very union. I picked up just a random job. I worked that for
mhm.
about 2 months before my instructor reached out to me and said, "Hey, I saw this listing. I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who's hiring." And I reached out, sent the guy
Interesting.
my resume, and I took that job.
And does Job Corps train you on it sounds like they're incredibly helpful. The instructors are incredibly helpful in placing, but do they also train you on how to put together a resume?
Yeah, as you get closer, when you first get there, they have classes on all that. And then again, as you get close to finishing, you go through a couple of classes at the very end. Here's your basic resume templates. Here's how cover letters, putting those together. Then they'll review them, help you rewrite them, and then introduce you to methods of finding employment. Back then included the employment office. Now I can't speak to it because I don't even know if those really exist. They would go through mock interviews with people in the profession, which would usually be someone that the instructor knew, would usually
Mhm.
come in a couple of times a year and they would do mock interviews. It would be great if they had a directory of companies that have worked with Job Corps in the past and are great
Mhm.
places to place people. Because it was more like talk to the instructor, he'd flip through a Rolodex. You're like, okay, you're going here, I know this person. Versus if you had something that was more available, that easier
Okay.
connection that in the modern time would be great.
What were your ranking of criteria? First and foremost, I'm sure it was get a job, but in that directory, what would your criteria of most important to least important things be as far as wage, commute, that kind of stuff?
Wage would definitely be up there, especially when you're leaving Job Corps. They give you a small amount when you leave to help you establish. I guess it would be cooperation and how long students have stayed with that company, because that was something ran into was a lot of construction is you're up for a couple months and then you're down, and then up for a couple months and then down. It was very unreliable income at first.
Would you consider taking a lower wage if you knew you had year-round income?
Oh yeah. So and also, again, when I ended up leaving the field, was my wife was one of the people who could not stand that. She could not stand the unreliability. So that's when I went back, when I went to college.
Did you enjoy the work while you were doing it?
I loved it. I'm still in the market for, I would like to buy myself a little grader so I can maintain my own driveway type thing. And I've got a buddy who has a substantial dirt road that he lives on, and every couple of years they rent a grader and I go run it. And I love every minute of it. No, I really did love it. And there's a lot of really physically exhausting, grueling days, but there were some that it was just like, I can't believe I get to play with Tonka toys for a living.
And did you ever take pictures of your work or log jobs you were proud of in any way?
Not really. I guess that was back then. I think when I left, I had a very basic Nokia phone. And I think I didn't really have a smartphone for a while into that. And then after that, probably not. And I know of locations I worked at, but I guess I didn't really take any pictures like I should have.
Yeah. It's hard when you don't have a smartphone, I guess, but
Yeah. And if I still had my Facebook account, I can't actually recall back to having some photos that I took when I was first at it, feet up on equipment and stuff like that.
cool. And was there any semblance of resume upkeep, or when you were switching jobs or through the ups and downs, how to
Uh,
update your resume? Or yeah,
I
or
would kind
even
of
if you
leave it
didn't
pretty
update it.
big blocks. I would usually just update by the year who I would usually do year to year who I was working for that year, the majority of the year. Or the one thing I learned was to pair off anything that wasn't really applicable. So the first time I interviewed for the job and he's looking at my resume, he's like, well, I don't give a crap about that.
Yeah.
Looking at the other jobs I'd had, he's that's irrelevant. That's irrelevant. Okay. So you've run this and this. Okay.
If you could wave a magic wand and change any of those, the process of looking for a new job, what do you think you would do? Or what would you take off your plate for that next job search that you didn't enjoy doing?
At first, I was doing a lot of cover letters, and I realized those were worthless in the construction industry, as long as you're going for a smaller company. Yeah, the upkeep. I think it would be great in that type of industry. It's if you had hours spent or years on specific equipment. Like when we were in Job Corps, we maintained hour logs. Depending on what machine we were running, we logged how many hours we were on it. I think that would be the ultimate way to judge someone's fitness to come in and run equipment, is not who they've worked for, but how long they've spent on specific pieces of equipment. So as a student, it would be usually another student would teach you and show you the basics of it. And then the instructor would be keeping an eye on you, making sure. Then he would usually interject a couple times how to do it properly. In the real world, there's a lot of get up there and see what happens. They give you quick, this machine does this, or that one you have to jump the starter solenoid with a screwdriver, stuff like that. But it was a lot of, you just had to get up there, get the feel of the machine. Usually within about an hour of sitting on a piece of equipment, you had an understanding of how that one would run.
And now, as a hobbyist machine operator, do you still like explore content online? Are you going to YouTube at all or anything?
Yeah, and I follow stuff on Instagram on vintage heavy equipment. I follow, always interested in what Caterpillar's putting out and other stuff, and always searching Craigslist, seeing if I could magically buy myself a little excavator. When you did learn in Job Corps, there are stupid rules you have to follow. And one of those, we had a big change where students could no longer operate the cars. So when I was initially there, when I was there, I was the foreman of my crew. And my instructor would sit in the passenger seat and I would just drive us when we went off site and do all that. Then they rescinded that rule, said we couldn't, so then we had to go and get all of our lunch material every morning from the cafeteria if we were off site. We couldn't drive a 4,000-pound Suburban. So every morning I would get there early enough that I could do a pre-check, and I would take a 45,000-pound front loader to go get a couple of coolers. And that was just spite. But that was my commute.
Do you stay in contact with anyone from those days still?
Yeah, I've got a couple of friends that I made there that I'm still in touch with, and through Instagram and stuff like that. And then, yeah, that's about it.
Cool. And any advice to like other people who are considering Job Corps or the trades in general that you have?
The biggest thing is attitude, is just having that ability to be humble, or just don't go in expecting them to make changes for you. They're going to expect you to change. And that's exactly what they're there for. And I saw a lot of people who got discouraged because they went in and thought that they were special and expected special treatment, or they expected things to change for them. And it didn't work out for them. And I guess that's even same in most construction jobs. If you're the new guy, you just shut up and work. Don't interject. Don't think you can do something a better way than the company is doing it. Just go to work, and eventually you'll be to a point where your input's valuable, but not at first.
And who would you go to if you did have questions or advice you needed? Who was your first phone?
In the industry, probably would have been back to my instructor, Ken. If not him, it would have been one of the other students that I went with who were working in the field. And I did reach out when I started first with the union in New Mexico. I reached out to the kid I was roommates with for the most of the time there, and we were in trade together and friends. I'd have questions for him. Hey, what do I need to do to get this done? Or how do I do this? Stuff like that.
Can you speak to the process of switching from non-union to union and what that application process and the differences was?
Yeah, down in New Mexico, it was pretty easy because unfortunately, it was not a very strong union down there. So the wages weren't as great as they could be, but it was pretty easy. It was just like joining any other job. And then once you were accepted into the union, you're expected to go to the training center once a month for so many hours if you weren't currently working. And then as you go out there, and I think just once I made the trip out. Once or twice I made the trip out there for training and just getting some skills brushed up on. And then they had a job to send me to. And that's all they would do. They would match you up with an employer and they would just send you there. And you would go there and everything, you just do your I-9 stuff and they would send you into the field. You didn't have interviews. You didn't have anything like that.
And how long were those assignments typically on average?
I think the shortest one was about 3 months and the longest was 9.
And you only paid dues when you're working, is that right? Or is it
Correct.
dues? Okay. Or is it taken out of each paycheck or is it a lump sum?
Yeah, every paycheck.
It's super insightful to hear like the gaps are an issue.
Yeah.
Because the huge shortage right now, I'm sure a lot of people don't like those gaps. It's just unnerving. And if you could get more people.
Yeah, I mean, I think now that, in this modern economy, I don't think that happens as much. But And this other thing is in the Northwest versus New Mexico, we always laid off in November to December. When I was working in Portland, it was just too rainy, and it's like you couldn't do much work. So we'd go into seasonal layoff for 3 months or so until it got to the point where you could safely work again. The Job Corps location I went to, it was in another state because it was the only one that offered that training. And then when I moved back to Oregon, I got married, and my wife's education and training took us to New Mexico for 5 years. And then so we moved back. So that was a lot of stuff that was outside my control to move. I had a pretty good lead on. I knew I was going to apply for the union when I got down there because they were hiring, unlike the union in Portland that had a year or so backlog to even interview people. The one in New Mexico was actively hiring. I knew that when I got down there. And then the same thing I've always, when we moved back, I had a job before we moved. And then again, we moved to another city in Oregon. And again, I had a job before I moved.
What are the projects that are most memorable and you're most proud of that you worked on?
I can't remember what the school name is now, but outside Yakima, we built a beautiful sports complex for them. We did all the ground leveling maintenance, lifted where it was low, dropped where it was high, and built all the infrastructure out for that, the dirt work. And that's still fun to flip through, can see it on Google Earth. And then in New Mexico, I was on civil work. And so it was a lot of fun to go drive down a road that you built. I did all the underwork for. I ran the grader that moved the gravel or set grade on it, stuff like that.
And are references a part of that at all, or are those kind of hit or
Yes.
miss as well?
Yeah, those are definitely helpful. They'll usually reach out and check, see if you're useful. The big thing is drug screening. A lot of people who just couldn't stay in the field because they couldn't not do drugs.
Especially with heavy machinery.
I guess if they could almost work in similar fashion that the union does, but if they had lots of contacts out there and being like, hey, I want to send you this employee to interview at that point. If they're a private entity, it'd be in their best interest to interview them, stuff like that. But that could help. Plus, there can be that discouragement when you're looking for jobs and you never get one. Maybe there's something wrong with your resume. So having the ability to, if someone hasn't gotten a job right away, check their resume, see what they're doing wrong.
Yeah.